I've been at the college in New Jersey 33 years.
And I've been here 13 years, full-time. I was an adjunct before I was full-time faculty.
I relocated to New Jersey after I got married and taught high school for 1 year, but I wanted to teach at the college level, so I became aware of the job here and applied.
Well, I was, this is my second career. I was a science writer at Bell Labs and had always wanted to teach writing and was spending most of my time at Bell Labs really building up the credentials to be able to teach, I thought, generally as my retirement job. And for reasons, I decided to accelerate that timetable, and I was invited to be a guest lecturer in the Introduction to Professional Writing class, which was then run by Ellen Friedman. And after that lecture, she asked me what my plans were, and I told her what they were, and we arranged a visiting professorship, and I came here as an adjunct for 2 years, and then an opening materialized, and I applied for it and got it.
I should say it's interesting because I too was recruited by an employee, Dr. Casper Lonesome, who at that time ran the EOS program, which was called Private at that time. And he went out statewide at the request of President Brower. He traveled statewide, actually recruiting African American and Latino faculty and staff. The African American Studies Department existed when I arrived, and I was told by students who were involved in the negotiations, shall we say, to establish the department, that it came about as a result of student protests in the late 60s, the same way that many such departments came to be. The first director was invited to other employment, and Professor Don Evans, who at that time was a special assistant to President Brower, was asked to take over the chairmanship of African American Studies in 1972. I transferred from the English department into African American Studies in 73.
And of course, I've never been a member of the African American Studies department here, but I think there are a couple of things that it's important to keep in context that have to do with the way both of our academic careers developed, which is that African American Studies emerged as a field in the 1960s as part of the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement. One of the things that began to develop was a kind of intellectual of the academy, along with other institutions in society, and their participation in the perpetuation of racism. So it was recognized that racism had continued for so long was that people had not been taught about the history of people who were not white, that people been exposed to the range of histories of people of African descent, so that in every institution in society, whether it was the press, industry, the academy, there were people making demands that those institutions more fairly represent all elements of American society, and students were at the forefront of all of that critique and that effort. So I know where Dr. Dickinson went to graduate school, there was at Howard University. There were major protests. Even black students at a historically black institution were protesting that historically black institution was not doing an adequate job of representing African history, African American history, and the intellectual needs of the black community. Where I was at Princeton University, there were similar kinds of protests, and much of that was led by students, not just as protesters, but when the administration in these institutions would sit down and say, okay, we're willing to talk about making changes, we were the ones who had curriculum proposals, we were the ones who had to come up with the program proposals, we were the ones who had to recruit often the faculty and the administrators who were going to, supposedly support us. And that, interestingly, has gotten to be a pattern where we've kind of had to build our own houses, So my first experience, not only in terms of protest politics, but project management, program planning, coalition building, negotiation skills, all of those things came about, networking came about as a result of being a student activist. And we considered ourselves responsible for creating an alternative education within the mainstream, as we used to say, in the belly of the beast.
I think it's important to also realize that African American studies as conceptual was and is both interdisciplinary and an academic discipline that said from the very beginning it had a commitment, responsibility, and obligation to those outside of the academy, which is quite different from the mainstream academy. I was just looking at an article before we came in that happened to have had a copy of the history department course offerings at Howard in the year 1919, I think it was. And what was interesting, the article was talking about the course offerings and that there were the professionalization of history. Mm-hmm. And there were several in what we would today call Black history. So Howard's history department from the teens actually was teaching courses in what they called Negro history and had multiple course offerings. Mm-hmm. But they were not part of an interdisciplinary interrogation of the experiences of people of African ancestry. So when you see the protests on historically Black college and university campuses, understand that those campuses' curricula were all over the map. Some may have only had a Negro history course. Some may have had courses in a variety of departments, but they were being taught from a disciplinary focus, and the interdisciplinarity that has become sort of emblematic of African American studies wasn't there. There were different requests being made on different campuses, but what you end up with is a pretty universal acceptance of two key criteria, interdisciplinarity and the commitment to the community.
And I think there's one other piece of this too, which has to do with education in African American studies on the one hand, and what's the purpose of basically educating Black people? Because for many years, even before these protests, I think as far back 1930, 1933, you had W.B. Du Bois writing about the Negro college graduate, and arguing that just as members of other groups educate people in order to lead those groups, so Black colleges should be educating Black intelligentsia with an ethic of service to the race. And he wasn't the first one to say that. I mean, that had been going on since the 19th century. But he made the argument that then required being steeped in African history, African American history, certain interdisciplinarity, etc. And so there's that piece. One of the differences, I think, between that period and the period the 1970s is that African American studies has emerged as a discipline that isn't simply concerned with educating African descent who are going to be the leadership of the black community, and but it's become a discipline. It's become a disciplinary lens through which you any group of people, any part of the world, and which can be used by any group of people. So you have a lot of prominent African American studies now who are not African American, and whose students are not African American, but whose area of study, it has to do with African diaspora. That's a major change, and that's a reflection, I think, of the maturing of the discipline. It's also, I think, a post-Brown phenomenon, because the reality was that before versus Board of Education, indeed, I would say probably in our youth, if you were someone who studied in this field, whether you were black or white, it was likely that the only place where you were going to get to apply was going to be in a black educational setting. And
I think you could even go back earlier than that and say that pre-Brown Negro history was taught in segregated schools in the South and in the North, mm-hmm. and in black churches.
That's right.
So that the Negro History Week was known until 1976, when it becomes Black History Month, mm-hmm. was basically celebrated in African communities, which by default usually meant that the programs took place in the churches, right. and in the schools. So you don't get content isn't being shared with a non-African American, mm-hmm. constituency in any substantive way. Really, you could say it. Once it becomes Black History Month, mm-hmm. and there's a national dissemination of information, I think you begin to see a change in the constituency that has access to the information. Without a doubt. There are possibly offerings when the department began, and unfortunately, once the department was established, then every other department that should have been working to include information about people of color into their courses and curricula just sort of turned their backs and said, well, they're doing it over there, we don't need to bother. So, for example, the African American literature courses, which actually started in the English department on this campus, mm-hmm. given new course numbers when African American Studies was established as a department, and for, I'll say, at least a decade, were carried in the catalog as English 1, 2, 3 and FM 1, 2, 3. Then get dropped from the English, mm-hmm. curriculum, English offerings in the catalog completely. The courses still existed, but they're no longer shown as being a part of the English department offerings. So that when we hired a specialist in African American and diaspora literature 2 years ago, she came out of Rutgers University, where English majors were required, undergraduates, to take 2 courses in African American literature, get a bachelor's degree, hired into a department where not only was there no requirement, there was no course offering.
And the is, I know, if I had not had African American Studies courses available where I was, I would have had a lot of trouble. There's no African American Studies major at Princeton. There's a concentration. I have a certificate in African American Studies, and my undergraduate degree is in comparative politics. What I was interested in was how marginalized groups acquired power, and so it was an interdisciplinary interest. And African American Studies allowed me to take courses in history, in politics. We didn't say political science. In other fields, and in other fields that would connect with that interest, and I combined that with my politics courses on the Middle East, on China, my comparative revolutions courses, my comparative imperialisms courses, and so it allowed me to have a much more well-rounded education. That, with the practical experience that I was getting as a student activist, probably that was the kind of thing that I needed in order for my education to make sense to me. I don't think I would have graduated, at least not on time, if I hadn't had that option.
When I moved into the African American Studies, the college went through the first of many general education overhauls. And every time that has happened, the courses that meet the institution's newly revised general education criteria change. They don't just change, they have to be vetted again, even though in some instances the course has been taught for over 10 years. And I taught, not this last time, but the time before, with courses that were quite successful, had good enrollments, that never got recertified, if you will, as gen ed courses because the procedure for approval and the paperwork that went along with it was so unbelievably complex.
Mm-hmm.
And now should we say not user-friendly.
The other piece, though, is that what happens in disciplines like this is you end up with a small number of people, small cadre of people who are considered qualified to teach these courses, who specialize in these courses, because they're still marginalized in the academy. Those people then end up being the same people that everybody wants to advise all the student of color organizations, or even if you don't do it even if you don't do it formally, you do it informally. Those people also tend to be the people that everybody wants to have serve on the committee where they want some diverse representation, whatever committee that is. And I think we
Students.
No, not just students.
No, I'm saying those are also the people who end up serving as advisors to students of color who are not getting the type of advisement that they need in their major.
You end up having all these courses that are very valuable. This one little slot that most people, will fit them in, and and let's not talk about the fact that you have to, as with any gen ed course, overcome the fact that people are there not because they want to be, but because they've been, this is the thing that fits the category and that fit into their schedule. So it's that additional kind of marginalization, and the only thing that makes it bearable is knowing that without that, the colored classes might not exist.
I think, though, I have to say that this campus is peculiar in that during about a 20-year span, when other institutions did, in many instances, institutionalize American Studies courses into general education, this campus worked deliberately not to do that. And my example of, I always think of Indiana University in Bloomington, which is, a major research institution, but they have a large African American population. They do have one of the most respected African American Studies departments in the country with master's and PhD programs. The institution made a commitment early on and said that everyone enrolled at Indiana University had to complete 6 credits in African American Studies to get a degree. What that decision did was, first of all, it stabilized that department because they always had service courses in the same way that a math department does. And I've always said, nobody comes to the college door and knocks and says, oh, please let me take calculus. The institution says that this is what you must have to be an educated person, that when you go out into the world and you say, I hold a baccalaureate degree, the world expects a certain baseline, so that the institution says you must have a minimal level of exposure to
the following
discipline. Right. The institutions that said in the 1970s African American Studies is part of this now tend to be some of the places that have some of the strongest departments. Or whether it was done in the macro or the micro. Rutgers made that in terms of a lot of their majors. So that, for example, you could not get a degree in English without 2 courses in African American literature, and that was alongside a whole bunch of other requirements. Here, neither the general education nor the departmental decisions were ever made or enforced. So we often say that we have survived in spite of the institution as opposed to because of.
Ironically, one of the things that was started to happen in the 80s and 90s, institutions began, and I would say particularly elite institutions, began to recognize that a diverse curriculum was a source of competitive advantage. And so at the institutions that had strong African American Studies departments, strong ethnic studies departments, many of these are institutions that have also attracted star faculty, top flight corporate partners funding, and Harvard is case. How much money have they gotten from companies like Microsoft just to fund projects in African American Studies? When Ruth Simmons was president of Smith College, Ford Foundation came in and funded just a journal, just an academic journal, and that was, opening the door to millions of dollars. And it's, a small college. You can go on and on down the list, and in fact, I was involved as a Princeton alum during those years and watched. I sat on the University Priorities Council and watched the institution, watched Princeton engage in huge bidding wars to get people like Toni Morrison, fights people like Cornel West, Nell Painter, etc. And these are the people who end up on the PBS specials. These are the people who end up, as the Nobel Prizes, etc. Huge bidding wars. Now, the thing about it is, many of these people are top celebrity professors, and 12 people a semester get to take their classes, and they have to be admitted to their classes, and all of that, just as with elite professors anywhere. And it doesn't necessarily mean that this is what life is like for the worker bees within those departments. But the institution, this is a source of competitive advantage, and this is what you have to do to be an internationally ranked institution. So as the College of New Jersey seeks to elevate itself, I think that certainly the president of the college recognizes that this is an imperative, and that's one of the reasons that despite the fairly meager resources available to the department, it's one of the reasons that she's been supportive of a number of initiatives that have been undertaken.
Don Evans taught in the Department of African American Studies for 32 years. He came to the college as the director of the Minority Executive Council at the of then President Clayton Brown. And my understanding of the situation when all of us were hired, this 172, is that what was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the federal Department of HEW, had told the college, which only had 4 African American faculty, 300, and that time was 360, 370. And I don't even know if we could count, I don't think, 2 or 3 administrators. They basically have been told that they were not in compliance with federal law, and that if they didn't hire more people of color, they were going to lose their federal funding. Well, you know that if students can't get federal aid, it kind of upsets the apple cart. That's why Cass Lonesome was out driving all over the state of New Jersey as he was recruiting the students, because the EOF program was also relatively new in New Jersey. So as he was recruiting EOF students that year, he had also been asked to look for potential faculty and staff. Al Bridges was working here at that time. Al had just graduated from the college. He was in grad school. They sent him out. There were several people who were out traveling the state of New Jersey recruiting. I forget how many of us came in 71, and it was a substantial number, but I know that there were about 23, 24 people who came in 72. So I would say between the recruiting initiatives of those 2 years, they increased the Black and Latino faculty and staff, I'd say close to 40, between 35 and 40 new hires. And
some of whom are still here.
Some of whom are still
many
here.
of whom are not.
Yeah. What's interesting, you look at the faculty and see how many, that still, I think about half of the faculty come out of the Black faculty come out of that group. But my point is that that's when Don was hired, because part and parcel of what was going on was Dr. Brower saying that the college needed to address these issues in a more formalized way. So Don originally came in as the director of what was called the Minority Executive Council, which still exists, and it's an organization of faculty and staff of color, but it went from being a full-time paid position to now being a volunteer committee. So it's much different than when it was started. The college had made a poor choice in terms of their first director of African American Studies, and it wasn't just TCNJ, lots of places, and just kind of grabbed the first Black face that they saw and said, oh, will you come and chair our Black Studies department? Oh, it doesn't matter that you have a degree in accounting, just come and chair the department. Mm-hmm. They soon realized that the choice they'd made was not a particularly wise one, and asked Don to take over, asked the person who was not return. And Don then began to build the Department of African American Studies. Dr. Chikumba, who was a historian, was hired that year. Dr. Namashula, Larry Ridley, who now has taught for many years the jazz program. at Rutgers. He was here, Rex Gorley, the Afro-American artist whose work is now just off the charts in terms of trying to purchase it. The focus of the curriculum was very heavily leaning towards the arts. Really and truly had some of the top people in the field. I mean, we had an African art course, an African American gentleman who was actually the curator at the State Museum, who was a specialist in African art, and also an installation specialist. So it was a pretty wide array of courses. I have to say that what happened to us happened to a lot of institutions, and that was a humongous budget crunch for the state in 1977 and 78.
About the time of the energy crisis.
Yeah, and I mean, it all went in about 6 months.
And that's about the time I was graduating from college. And if I can say something about what I knew about Don during that time, he was teaching, the same time he was doing this at Trenton State, and Trenton State was a place where we used to go to party in the summer. And he was advisor for, there were two magazines produced by students of color. There was Prior to, there was Latini
Mana La Rosa Polka.
And yes, which we loved. And I was involved with a group called the Third World Center, which it was an organization of students of color, but it was mostly a progressive student organization where we developed courses and we brought in lecturers and planned protest against universities' involvement in companies doing business in South Africa and stuff like that. But a lot of us were African American studies students, and that department leaned much more heavily toward the social sciences, led by a sociologist by the name of Howard Taylor, had a historian, a Caribbean historian by the name of Edward Scobie, and had a sociologist who worked on black women by the name of LaFrancis Rogers Rose. And and Don was the theater guy. And he was the theater guy, he was the jazz guy, and he was someone who, at that time, we had in the English department one class in Africa, a class called Five Black Writers, that was taught by somebody who wasn't a faculty member. She was a dean, an administrator. And so if you wanted to study literature, theater, the arts, you had to go to this adjunct professor, Don Evans. When I came here as a faculty member, Don and I used to talk about those days, and he still remembered people who were my peers. I was a politics major, so I didn't get to take his classes. But he still had vivid memories of people who were good friends of his, and some of whom are no longer with us, and the impact that they had on him, the way that and he loved it when he would rethink his own assumptions. And, you know, we had a good friend, a guy named Michael Mintz, who came in and challenged him one day because Don was one of the leaders of the Black Arts Movement in the 70s. He was with people like Ed Bullins, who was the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party, and August Wilson, and Ntozake Shange, and was in his class. Mary Baraka, Leroy Jones. Mike was in his class and thought that Don basically was homophobic, and went off on him about it, okay? And I don't think one of us had ever met an openly gay person before in our lives in that way. I mean, Don was in the arts, I'm sure he had, but, you know, but certainly a young person who would, you know, and challenge him that way. And both Mike, Don, and I, we were all from Philly, and Don was he was a West Philly old head. And so here was this young boy, you know, who was going to get up in his face. And Don was impressed, and he was impressed by the intelligence of his arguments, and Don started to rethink um, his ideas about, you know, kind of the politics of his work in the 1970s, which is not something that a lot of folks in the black arts, you know, a lot of men who were involved in the black arts movement in the 1970s were not rethinking their politics with regard to gender and sexuality. And I say that just as, as an example of the kind of intellect and the kind of values he had. And in fact, one of the things, and I don't know, he was working on a play, actually, about Mike. That was one of our last conversations. He said, I'm writing about Mike. And actually, there's a documentary called Word Is Out that has Mike in it. And one of our, every once in a while, he and I would talk about it, because Don was the person who told me that Mike had died of AIDS. Mike was my best friend at Princeton. And, like I said, he was working on this play about Mike. I never saw it, but he was so excited about it. That was the other thing about him. He was an incredibly dedicated artist. And
an incredibly dedicated.
Yeah, but I mean, if he was doing something that made him learn something new, and he was doing something that exposed him to beauty, and I mean beauty in terms of an idea as well as, aesthetics, he was like a little kid. We're going to have this tribute to him in February. And the last big argument I remember having with him was in an AFAM department meeting, and we were talking about Black History Month planning, and I wanted to do a production. If you remember this?
No.
I wanted to do something about his work, because I think it was approaching like the 30th anniversary of his being here or something, and there had already been a commemoration of the 30th anniversary of African American Studies. This ought to be part of what we do. And he said, no, I don't want that. He said, I'd much rather do an Alice Childress play. He was very loved her work. He really, really was. And he said, that's what I want to do. And he was always, he wanted to do for Color Girls too, but he thought a woman should direct it. And I mean, we argued about that. And when we found out that Don was sick and we started working on this tribute, I had this fantasy that somehow, like, if we worked on the tribute, he'd have to hang around long enough to come. And when he died, I kind of thought, that would be just like Don. I told you I didn't want to go to no tribute. About 2 years ago, a friend of mine took me to a black tie premiere of an August Wilson play. It was just a night, and it was the Black Theater Network, and there were celebrities there, and I met Larry Fishburne and Danny Glover and all these people, and Don was one of the founding members of the Black Theater Network board, and so I was expecting to see him there. And when people found out where I worked, they said, "Oh, where's Don?" I said, "Well, I don't know." And afterwards, I saw him, and I said, people were about you, and I met all these famous people, and all they wanted to know was where you were. He said, "I'm putting on a tuxedo." He said, "I had to pay for the ticket anyway, but I'm putting on a tuxedo." And that was just like Don, contrary. Very contrary.
Yeah. Don didn't like administration. He did.
He was an artist.
But he was really an artist. He taught the black music class, the jazz class, the Black Man in American Film was one of the courses he developed, which was always very, very popular. Black Theater, the Black Theater Workshop, and Harlem Renaissance, because he truly loved the Harlem Renaissance. Don really started and built the department. He gave up the chair, and I became chair when he really, really did a lot of writing. mid to late 70s on into the 80s is when he really did a lot of creative stuff. He went out Ohio to Caramoo. Playhouse was one of the oldest black theaters in the country, and he was their artistic director for 2 years, and then he came back and started teaching again. The Princeton connection, I taught at Princeton High before he came here. He was teaching at Princeton High when he was hired to come here.
Is that when he had Christopher Reeves as a student?
I don't know, but I know he had a lot of, that Princeton community was such as the people, in terms of the black community. Mm-hmm. The black students tended to worship at the black churches in Princeton, mm-hmm. which meant that people knew one another. Mm-hmm. And even though he didn't live in Princeton, he was a part of that mm-hmm. community. One of the ways that people at Princeton knew him to even reach out to him to ask him to come and teach a course was because of the connection that he already had mm-hmm. established in the Princeton community.
He established community theater groups, and a lot of his plays that would ultimately end up off-Broadway or being done by professional theaters both in the United States and elsewhere were first performed here by students, at Princeton by students, or
in the Players Company.
In the Players Company.
Which was a local Trenton black theater company that he started. Yeah. One of the things that I'm really excited about for the February tribute, the Pamela Smith Chambers is directing, and she's an alum. She was one of the founding members of Players Company. She had managed to find the people who created the roles for every one of the plays that she had selected to take excerpts from.
I don't think that people realized until, Don one point, remarked to me that at the time there were only 2 people on campus who were in Who's Who. This is when the previous president and one was the then president of the college, Dr. Akal. The other person was him. And I don't think that a lot of people, even on campus, recognized, well, some of our colleagues even admitted it, his stature outside of the campus until, his obituary showed up in the New York Times and in Playbill and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the LA Times. And, it just goes, and was picked up by Associated Press and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. So, miss the guy.
Yeah, sure do.